The dust of Foul Ridge had a bitter taste. Bitter as gunpowder, dry as old bones. Eleanor Hayes knew that taste well now. She had been swallowing it for 3 days since the stagecoach left her in this forgotten town, with nothing but a carpet bag and a promise that turned to ash. That promise had sounded simple back in Ohio. Travel west, meet Samuel Morrison, marry him, tend his homestead. She had sold everything she owned to make the journey, clutching the letters that spoke of fertile soil and clear water. But when she reached his land, there was no Samuel Morrison. Only an empty plot and townsfolk who shrugged when she asked. Been gone 2 months. One said maybe 3. And now, instead of a husband waiting, she found herself standing in the town square with the rest of the crowd, drawn by morbid curiosity. In the center of the square stood an iron cage, tall as 2 men, wide as 6. Its bars were thick as wrists, its door locked fast. Inside sat a figure, motionless, head bowed, chained to the floor like a dangerous beast. Even from a distance, Eleanor could see his clothes were ragged, his dark hair matted, his body thin but still broad, with the shadow of old strength. The late sun turned the cage into an oven, baking him alive while the townsfolk whispered. "How long's he been in there?" someone asked. 3 weeks come Tuesday. Another answered. "Sheriff's keeping him till the circuit judge comes through." "What'd he do?" "Killed a man up in the mountains." Maybe more than one. They say he went wild after what happened to his family. The words made the crowd shift nervously, as if even caged he might strike. Eleanor moved closer, unable to stop herself. She'd seen cruel men before. Her father, her late husband, they had a hardness in their eyes, a hunger for violence. But this man, this prisoner, sat too still, too controlled, not like an animal, like someone carved from grief. "Why keep him like that?" Eleanor asked aloud without thinking. A woman beside her snorted. "Because that's what he is, an animal. They found bones in his cave, human bones. And the Garrett family's wagon not far from there." Eleanor's stomach knotted, but still she watched him. His head remained lowered, his silence unbroken. No snarling, no pacing. Just stillness, heavy as stone. Sheriff Bradley's voice rang out. "Move along, folks. Nothing more to see." Quote, the crowd began to drift away, but Eleanor stayed rooted. The sheriff noticed and frowned. "Ma'am, best not to linger. Is he fed?" "Given water?" she asked. "Of course he is. We ain't savages," the sheriff snapped, "but don't get close." He near bit a man's finger off last time. Eleanor ignored him and stepped toward the cage. The prisoner did not look up, even when her shadow fell across the bars. "Sir," she said softly. "Nothing." She turned to the sheriff. What was his crime, truly? Not rumors. Not bones years old. Actual proof. Sheriff Bradley's jaw clenched. "We found him, standing, over Tom Garrett's body, blood on his hands." "Was it self-defense?" "Doesn't matter," the sheriff growled. "Garrett was respected. Had a wife, children. This creature took him from them." Eleanor looked back at the man in chains. His hands bore scars of labor, not murder. She thought of her husband shot in the back over a land dispute, his killers walking free because they were respected men. The memory hardened her voice. "And so you'll hang him without trial, without even knowing his name?" The sheriff scowled. "What's it to you, ma'am?" Eleanor reached into her carpet bag. Her fingers touched a small cloth bundle. Her last possession of value. Her wedding ring. She had kept it not for love, but for survival, to sell if desperate. She pulled it out, and her voice carried across the square. "If you plan to kill him on nothing but fear and stories, then I will stand for him. I will marry him. Take responsibility for him. If he is the monster you say, I'll pay the price. But if he is not, then you will have hanged an innocent man." The crowd gasped. Laughter erupted, harsh and cruel. "You've lost your mind, woman!" someone shouted. "He'll kill you before morning!" But Eleanor stood firm. She had faced fists, hunger, widowhood, and the long road west. Fear no longer ruled her. She looked back at the man in the cage, and for the first time, his head lifted. Just slightly. Enough for her to see his eyes through the fall of dark hair, gray as winter storms, filled with pain so deep it stole her breath. "I'm of sound mind," she said to the sheriff, her voice steady, "and I know what I offer. This man has been condemned without defense. I will vouch for him." "Open the cage." The sheriff's face turned red, caught between law, pride, and the eyes of the crowd. "You're insane." "Perhaps," Eleanor replied, "but insanity is not illegal. Neither is marriage." The murmurs of the crowd swelled. An elderly man stepped forward, leaning on a cane. Judge O'Brien, the oldest voice of law in Foul Ridge. His gaze was sharp as he studied Eleanor. "Do you truly wish this child to marry a man you do not know, save for rumor and silence?" "I do," Eleanor said firmly, "because I know injustice when I see it. And I know loneliness, too." The judge turned to the prisoner. "And you, young man, do you consent?" For a long moment the square held its breath. Then, slowly, the man raised his shackled hands and pressed them together, a gesture of prayer or acceptance. The judge nodded. Then, so be it. "Sheriff, open the cage." The lock groaned, the iron door swung wide, and the silent man stepped out into the fading light. Shackles, still on his wrists, dust on his skin, storm-gray eyes locked on Eleanor Hayes, the woman who had just traded her freedom for his. And in that moment, the square knew a story had begun. The air in Foul Ridge turned heavy as the man stepped out of the cage. Chains clinked with every movement, but his silence was louder than all the whispers around them. Eleanor felt the eyes of the whole town burning into her back. But she didn't flinch. She had made her choice. "Keep the shackles on." Sheriff Bradley barked. "He leaves this town bound," the judge's voice carried across the square. "You've held him caged 3 weeks without trial, Sheriff. If this woman claims him as husband, then the law says he leaves as a man, not a beast." The sheriff cursed under his breath but obeyed. The townsfolk pressed closer, some shouting for her to stop, others gawking like it was a show. Eleanor stood tall, holding up her wedding ring. "I, Eleanor Hayes, widow of Ohio, take this man as my lawful husband," she declared. The judge nodded, eyes narrowing at the prisoner. "And do you take this woman as your wife?" The man's throat worked as if trying to remember how to form words. For a moment nothing came. Then he raised his shackled hands, touched his chest, then pointed at Eleanor. He pressed his palms together again, a vow in silence. The judge lifted his cane. "By my authority, I pronounce you man and wife." He looked at Eleanor with pity. "God help you, child." The crowd erupted in noise, mockery, disbelief, even anger. But Eleanor ignored them. She reached for the man's hand. He flinched, then stilled as she slipped the small gold ring onto his finger. It barely fit his smallest finger, but he curled it tight, protecting it like something precious. "Now get out of my town," the sheriff growled. So they did. Eleanor picked up her carpet bag and started walking. The man followed, chains dragging, his bare feet stirring the dust. At the edge of town, Sheriff Bradley shouted, "The shackles come off once you're clear. Send them back with a traveler, or I'll hunt you down." Eleanor clenched her teeth but kept walking. When the last building fell behind them, she stopped and turned. He stood there, tall and scarred, eyes storm-gray, staring at her as though waiting for permission. "Can you walk?" she asked. He gave a single nod. "Then let's put miles between us and them." They walked until the sky bled into night. When Eleanor finally stopped near a patch of juniper trees, her feet ached and her throat was raw. She turned to him. "We'll camp here." For the first time since leaving the cage, he moved with purpose. Despite the chains, he gathered branches, arranged them carefully, and struck stones until sparks lit the kindling. Soon a small fire pushed back the night. Eleanor watched in silence, surprised. He was no wild beast. His movements were practiced, patient. From her bag, she pulled hardtack and dried beef, laying them between them. He hesitated before taking any, then ate slowly, like a man unused to plenty. When he disappeared into the brush, her heart stuttered. Had he run? But moments later, he returned with prickly pear fruits, carefully cleaned of spines. He offered them to her first. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded once, eyes flickering with something unreadable. Later, she unpacked her sewing kit and began mending the worst of his torn shirt. By firelight, she saw the scars that crisscrossed his ribs. Knife cuts, bullet wounds, claw marks. Old wounds. Not the fresh violence of a killer, but the long history of a man who had survived too much. "You've lived through hell," she whispered. He didn't move, but when she glanced up, his storm-gray eyes were fixed on her. As she worked, Eleanor spoke. She told him of Ohio, of her gentle husband James shot in the back over land, of the law that had looked away. Her voice wavered, but the firelight and his silence made confession easier. When she finished, he surprised her by pointing at her carpet bag. She handed it over cautiously, and he studied the fraying handle. With his bound hands and teeth, he removed the stitches stronger than before. Then he handed it back, his meaning clear. "I mend your bag. You mend my shirt." "Fair trade," Eleanor said with a small smile. He gave the faintest nod, almost a ghost of agreement. As the fire burned low, Eleanor spread her thin blanket on the ground. "We'll share," she said firmly. "It's not proper, but propriety doesn't matter out here." He shook his head, pointing to the cold ground. "You'll freeze," she insisted. Reluctantly, he lay down at the very edge of the blanket, his back to her, taking up as little space as possible. Eleanor slid beneath it, close enough to share warmth. After a long silence, she whispered, "Tomorrow, we'll find a way to remove those shackles." The chains rattled as he shifted slightly. She reached out, touched his shoulder gently. He flinched hard, then stilled. His breathing came fast, shallow. But slowly, very slowly, he let himself relax. "Good night," Eleanor said softly. He didn't answer, but she thought she felt the faintest nod in the darkness. For the first time since Ohio, she slept without fear. Dawn came with a thin mist crawling over the valley. Eleanor woke to find the blanket tucked tightly around her while the man was gone. Panic stabbed her chest, but then she saw him by the creek, bent over the shackles. He was grinding the lock against a sharp stone, his wrists raw and bleeding where the metal bit into flesh. "Let me help," Eleanor said softly, stepping closer. He shook his head and kept working. Sparks flickered as he pressed stone to steel, jaw clenched with determination. Eleanor fetched water from the creek, knelt beside him, and carefully washed the blood from his skin. He stilled, watching her with storm-gray eyes, and allowed her to smear salve from her small tin over the wounds. His scars told his story as clearly as words ever could. Burns, cuts, and calluses that belonged not to a killer, but to a craftsman. By the time the sun climbed higher, one lock broke open with a sharp crack. The shackle fell into the dust, leaving his left hand free. His eyes widened, as if he had forgotten what freedom felt like. Within an hour, the other shackle dropped too. He stood, breathing hard, then picked up the chains. With a fury that startled her, he smashed them against a boulder again and again until the twisted metal was useless. When he finally hurled the pieces into the ravine, his chest heaved like a man unburdened of years of grief. "Better?" Eleanor asked gently. He turned to her, and for the first time he touched her hand. Just a brief press of rough palm against hers, but it was thanks enough. They traveled together into the mountains. Eleanor stumbled often in her worn boots, but he steadied her each time, guiding her with patience. When she winced from blisters, he stopped, stripped bark from a cottonwood, and patted her shoes with it, easing her pain. He said nothing, yet every gesture spoke louder than words. By afternoon, they reached a valley. Samuel Morrison had once promised her in letters. She expected a cabin, maybe smoke curling from a chimney. Instead, there was only a half-dug shelter in the hillside, abandoned. Broken beams jutted like bones. So this was it. she whispered bitterly. All his promises lies. The man studied the ruins, then looked at her with quiet resolve. He drew in the dirt with a stick. A small cabin, smoke rising, 2 figures standing side by side. He pointed to her, then to himself. A home. Tears burned Eleanor's eyes. You'd help me build it? Even after everything, he nodded firmly. But when he drew more, a garden, a corral, a family, the stick faltered. His face darkened. He dropped the stick and turned away, fists clenched. Eleanor followed and found him at the creek, arranging pebbles in the dirt. 1 large stone, 2 smaller ones, and another off to the side. A man, a woman, 2 children. He pointed to the woman's stone, mimed cradling a baby, then scattered the small stones violently, tears standing in his eyes. Eleanor's heart broke. Your family, she whispered. They were taken from you. He nodded once, then covered his face with both hands. When he lowered them, she saw scars at his throat. Rope scars. She understood then. He had once tried to build again. The town had turned on him, called him cursed, nearly hanged him for surviving what no man should bear. Her voice trembled, but it held steady. You're not cursed. You're a man who loved deeply, who lost more than most could endure. But you're still here. You're still standing. He looked at her, and for the first time, his storm-gray eyes softened. He knelt, drew another picture in the dirt, this time of 2 figures in a cabin, and didn't erase it. That night, as the fire burned low, he surprised her. His voice rasped like rusted hinges, rough with years of silence. But the word was clear. Home. Eleanor's throat tightened. She reached for his hand. Yes, she whispered. Home. Weeks passed. Together they rebuilt the shelter into a cabin. He worked with the skill of a craftsman, cutting beams, shaping stone, fixing what was broken. Eleanor planted a small garden, stitched curtains from old cloth, and filled the home with warmth. Piece by piece, their valley stopped being a place of ghosts and became a place of beginnings. When they finally returned to Cedar Falls for supplies, whispers followed them, but something had changed. A child approached Jacob shyly, and he knelt to give her a tiny carved bird from his pocket. The girl's laughter rang out, and people stared, not in fear, but in wonder. Slowly, the story of the beast in a cage began to crumble. Months later, winter came down hard, wrapping the valley in snow. One stormy night, Eleanor woke to cries at the door. A young woman in labor, stranded, had been brought by the doctor. Their cabin became a birthing room. Eleanor worked by the doctor's side, and Jacob, silent but steady, held the frightened mother's shoulders until a baby's cry filled the room. When Jacob looked at that newborn girl, something inside him shifted. His voice came again, steadier this time. Perfect, he whispered. Eleanor touched his hand, knowing the weight of the word. In spring, when the flowers bloomed, he forged her a new wedding ring, iron for strength, silver for beauty, copper for warmth. He slipped it onto her finger by their hearth, his storm-gray eyes shining with something he had not dared before. Love, he said simply. Eleanor's tears spilled as she pulled him close. Yes, she whispered, love. From that day on, Eleanor Hayes was no longer a widow chasing broken promises. She was Eleanor Stone, wife to the man the world once feared, but she had chosen to see. Together they proved that even in the harshest wilderness, 2 broken hearts could build a home stronger than cages, stronger than grief. And in that cabin where the carved cradle waited by the fire, hope lived again.